What's up, you guys? Justin Rivas here, wanting to talk to you about the settings for the Panasonic G85, what's best for vlogging and, maybe a little bit for video as well. But I first want to start the video and talk about focusing. Focusing on this camera is going to be the biggest issue that you find as you're looking through cameras. And I can tell you, I spent a lot of time with the previous version of this, the G7, and I've already spent a lot of time with this camera. It's not a great focuser. I would say it is decent, not great. And so if that focus is the most important thing to you, then I would say look at a Canon 70D or 80D, or there's a new version of the 80D coming out. I can't remember what it's called, 750D or something like that. Look at those cameras. Those are the closest, I would say, in price comparison, while still having a flip-outy screen so you can see yourself. Sony's don't have that. They have great focusing, do 4K, a lot of things I like, but no flip-out screen. So look at the Canons if that focus is most important to you. If you're just a vlog, like you're just planning to vlog, you don't really care about 4K, you're not planning to do Facebook Live with your camera, which is another important side note, but if you take HDMI out of here and you try and plug it into a professional recorder or a little Facebook Live streaming box for your computer or something like that, the Canons will not give you a clean output, meaning the icons will still be on the screen of all the stuff. But if you're not doing that, look at the Canons. I would say they're really, really, really good in that regard, but they don't have 4K, they don't have the clean HDMI out. They're a little bit more expensive and a little bit heavier. But if you can get around that and say, I'm okay with medium focus, if you go watch my vlogs, I did 170 some of them now. I've made the focus work, but you do have to work with it a little bit more. But I will give you the settings, some tips and tricks. So let's jump into this and talk about that. So first of all, let's talk about that focus mode. So on the camera, we've got 6 different focus modes. I typically just sort between 2 of them. The first one is face or eye detection. And what this does is it does a good job of being able to pick out where your eye is and focus on that. And that is typically a really good thing, unless you're trying to maybe shoot over your shoulder a little bit and show something where you're talking to the camera like this and then you just want to point over your shoulder. That won't work for that because it'll continue tracking your eye. But generally, I would say if you're talking to the camera, flip to that mode and you will be good. It doesn't always, sometimes you're moving back and forward a lot. It will know where your eye is but won't catch that you've gone out of focus. But when you're talking to the camera, that is a good one. The one that I actually did most of my vlogging with is this one area mode. And that just allows you that once we select that, we can basically point anywhere on the screen. And that is what is going to be in focus, as well as it's actually going to adjust a little bit of where to set the exposure. We'll get into that setting a little bit more, but how bright, how light things should be. So those are typically the 2 modes I flip between. Now I've started using that face eye detection a little bit more when I'm talking to the camera. Or a top tip is if you're planning to do a little bit where you're talking to the camera, or maybe you're not using this camera for vlogging out in the real world, but you're using it like this, maybe doing makeup tutorials or sorts of things where you're talking to the camera, set the focus and then flip it to manual focus. And then your focus is going to be set and you're not really going to have to worry about it coming in and out of focus. Again, that's not if you're constantly throwing things right up in the screen, like you can see here, it's locked in, my hand's out of focus, Then try that single point mode, but if you're typically just talking, then use manual focus. That's that. Let's dig into the settings a little bit more. Photo style is going to be, your colors, your sharpness, your saturation. What I personally use is +2 contrast, +2 sharpness, 0 noise reduction, +2 saturation. I do this because I don't want to do a whole lot of color correction after the fact with this. And by getting this there, it gets me 90% of the way to all the kind of colors and the look that I'm going for. And I'm just doing it on a standard profile. You do have things like these Cinelike V, Cinelike D, and you can crank those way down and do all your color correction afterwards. It'll give you a lot more flexibility. But for something like vlogging, I've already got enough stuff going on that I don't really care to do all that color correction afterwards. I'm not making films. When I'm making more of movies or a little more film-like things, then I'll use those Cine-like profiles. And those open up, a little bit more like that flat color. You can do all your correction afterwards. Okay, so I use that kind of a custom standard profile. What else do we need to talk about here? Record format. So there are basically 2 modes that you're going to flip between: AVC HD and MP4. The only time you will use AVC HD is if you want to shoot at 24 frames per second, which is what, when you're looking at, cinematic movies, like in the movie theater, they're all shot at 24 frames per second. But this camera, for whatever reason, on MP4 won't do 24 frames per second at 1080p. It'll do it at 4K. But you don't always want to be shooting at 4K because those files end up being huge. And for a vlog, that extra quality, like I do it every once in a while for fun, but I'm typically wanting to shoot at 1080p. And so for me, I do AVC HD 1080p 24 frames per second for that cinematic feel. Now, you can choose whatever you want to do. You could do 30 frames per second, which isn't a whole lot different, but it is a little bit more like a TV video format than a film format. Or you can do 60 frames per second, which is really smooth motion. But the other benefit to 24 frames per second is you can then shoot at 60 frames per second and slow that down to 40%, and that's like 2.5 times as slow. And so it gives you some nice, slow motion action. And if you look at my little films around, this YouTube channel, you're going to see where I'm constantly using that slow motion and offsetting 24 for my regular stuff, bump it up to 60, film it in that, and then slow it down. But that's when you're in AVC HD. Otherwise, I would just go in MP4 if you're doing 60 frames per second, or you're wanting to shoot any 4K, be in that 4K mode. What else here? Exposure mode. So you've got 4 modes. You've got program, which basically the camera figures everything out for you. You've got aperture mode, where you control the aperture, which is, how wide open the lens is. That means how much light it lets in, how much it blurs the background. You've got shutter speed, where you can control basically the shutter and it takes care of everything else. And then full manual, where you're controlling everything. I personally use the aperture priority mode because I've got so many other things to worry about. Typically what I want to be doing is blurring that background as much as I can, which also lets in the most amount of light. And when you're indoors, you want to be letting in as much light as possible so the camera isn't working super hard. And aperture is kind of the easiest way to be able to do that. Unfortunately, in the manual mode, you can't set aperture and shutter speed and let it automatically do the ISO. If that's really technical, don't worry about it. Just do aperture or do program. You'll be okay. But if you are a little bit more of a tech head, on the G85, you cannot do auto ISO in manual. That's coming with the G85, but not currently on the G85. So I do aperture. Focusing mode, I do AFS. And then lower down, you'll see continuous autofocus. That means it's going to constantly try and keep me in focus, which it does most of the time, but not all of the time. Let's talk about metering mode. This is actually kind of important depending on what you're doing. You've got 3 settings for metering mode. The one I use on the bottom is spot metering. Basically what metering does is it's a camera figuring out how bright or dark to make the scene. If you're shooting in full manual controlling all this doesn't really matter, but if you're in aperture mode, with spot metering on, what I do is I focus on my face, or you'll notice that eye detection will figure out where your face is and will make sure that your face is the right brightness. Sometimes you're outdoors and something is super bright at the background, and if you have one of these other modes which more make the whole scene the right brightness, what can happen is your face will either be too bright or too dark. But I feel like when you're vlogging and you're talking to the camera, you want to make sure that your face is the right brightness. So I'll do spot mode, and then whatever I tap on to focus, if you're using that single point, that thing will be properly exposed, and everything else may or may not be. You can use these other modes, like the top one, probably the only other option. It'll try and make sure the whole scene is as balanced as possible, but again, your face may be too bright or too dark. So I personally use spot metering, but you're gonna notice sometimes the background is too dark or too bright, but your face will consistently be the right brightness. The other setting that is important here is this eye dynamic. What eye dynamic does, and I've got it set to standard, you can do a little bit more or less depending what you're doing, is it will actually brighten the dark areas and make the really bright areas a little bit darker, kind of evening it out so that if it's a really bright background, it'll make that a little darker, and if your face was too dark, it'll brighten that up. And that's actually pretty handy for vlogging. You may not want to do that when you're creating films, but for vlogging, I found it to be pretty handy where I've got a hat on and my face, it brightens up my face a little, darkens the background, so it's just a little bit smoother. Play around with that a little bit. What else do I actually use in here? Stabilizer. So the stabilizer, this has in-body image stabilization, and so that is able to be on, and that's currently on. You can change this depending on the mode so that it's only, this would be more when you have a lens with image stabilization attached. You can make this middle one so it only stabilizes up and down but doesn't do left and right. This is good if you're shooting shots where you're panning, because otherwise the stabilizer will kind of hiccup a little. You hit that mode, and then when you're panning it'll be smooth, but it'll stop it from shaking up and down, so it'll almost look like it's on a tripod when you're panning. That's pretty handy. You have this E-stabilization mode. What this does is it crops the video a little bit, and then kind of moves it around for an extra level of stabilization. It's a little bit tech heavy, but if you're using the kit lens, I wouldn't use this because the kit lens already isn't super wide, especially if you're doing something like 4K. That E-stabilization makes it less wide, so you're even closer to the camera. And I like for vlogging for it to be as wide as possible, but it can add an extra layer of smoothness. So just use it as needed. It looks a little bit funny because it's electronic stabilization, but I definitely leave the stabilizer on. Most of the time, I don't use the stabilization, even though I could with the super wide angle that's on there, but the look of it's a little bit funny, but can be handy. What else? Silent operation I usually leave on so that people around me aren't hearing all the beeps of things going on. Mic level display on. I like to be checking, making sure that the microphone's actually working. You can see that little display in the corner. My mic level adjust is at -6 decibels. I found that just works good. I've got a loud voice. You may want that a little bit louder. That's where I start. And the mic level limiter is on. What that means is if I talk too loud, it will turn down the volume a little bit so it isn't clipping and making those popping or those distorted noises. And I leave the wind cut off because I've got a windsock on here. If you don't and you're just using the camera's onboard microphone, you're somewhere windy, you can try that. It sounds a little bit funny. What else for settings on here? Only other things I'll maybe mention are autofocus sensitivity. Now you can turn this up or down, which means it will try and acquire focus more quickly or wait a little bit and be a little bit slower in adjusting that focus. Honestly, I haven't found that it makes that big of a difference. When it comes to focusing, if you made it this far, you're maybe a little bit more into the tech side of it. Max Urov had a great video where he tested the autofocus of the Sony versus the new Olympus EM1 Mark II and the G85. And he did a follow-up video where he played around with the sensitivity. It didn't make a huge difference, but it does, if it gets focus, it speeds it up. And so in getting there, which, you know, can be handy. Anything else in here? Just double checking that there's not something. Only other thing that maybe you can do is you can customize the buttons on here so that you can have the things that you want more quickly available so you don't always have to go into the menu. But other than that, I would say those are the settings that I use here. And going back to the focusing comment, if you're making films, right now, I would say Sony, the A6500 is a fantastic option for its focusing abilities, but there's no flip out screen. So if you need to see yourself, it doesn't really work. The only other thing too is Sony lenses are very expensive, where I found the Panasonic has a few more affordable options, and Canon, obviously, really good lens options. Other than that, I would say if you don't need 4K, you're not doing the Facebook Live thing. Look at the Canons, but I've been really happy with this camera. It's just that the focusing frustrates me every once in a while when it misses focus. I do lots of things to make sure it doesn't happen, but I noticed in the last vlog there was a moment where I was walking and talking on the street and it missed the focus, and that annoyed me. But generally pretty good. Those are the settings I use. Hopefully that was helpful to you. Obviously a long video. Any questions at all, you guys know that you can ask them, and I'm glad to answer them as soon as I can. I'm Justin Rivas. Thanks for watching.